Welcome to this month's meeting of the New York Society for General Semantics. Yes. Well, those of you that are new here, we meet irregularly, but relatively monthly, and with topics of interest to the community of general semantics. And we don't require any admission fee or any membership fee from you, but we do encourage you to become members of the Institute of General Semantics, which you can get to online by Googling Institute of General Semantics or generalsemantics.org, or by through a link from the New York Society site, which you use to register from. And we have a little background music that we're going to turn off or unplug because it's a little distracting. Thank you, Terry. So, that brings us to tonight's program, and that background music.
She just changed it, that's all.
Oh, okay. Something better? Better?
Looking for the rock and roll station.
Or heavy metal?
Just kidding.
Just hold the plug, yes. Now, if only Neil Postman were here, he would just say,
Cole
"Turn
Porter.
it off." Right.
He was
But
on
it's
Cole
a committee
Porter
working
there.
on it now, and so we'll get it done within a day or two. In the meantime, at the start of this year, I mean, we're getting close to the end of the year, but this year began our first meeting, our first program of the year, January 26th. We held a panel discussion that featured a group of out-of-towners on this very topic. How many of you were here for that? Give yourselves a hand, right? And you may remember, you probably don't, but you may remember that I promised that we would do a follow-up with better people.
But you couldn't find them.
You realize this is being recorded.
Good point. Yeah, unfortunately, we have to, as Donald Rumsfeld put it, you go to war with the army you have, not the one you want. But no, we're very happy to have this group together today. And let me just begin with the introduction that you may have read already, but this is commemorating the 50th anniversary of Neil Postman's formal introduction of the term Media Ecology, which occurred at the 58th annual meeting of the National Council of Teachers of English, which was held in Milwaukee. That's somewhere to the west of here. On November 29th, 1968. So we're one day short of the 50th anniversary.
Wow.
Ooh, you can applaud to the applause.
We could go to
No. At that time, Postman gave an address that was entitled Growing Up Relevant, and it was the main part of a program session that was entitled, and this appears in the NCTE conference program, Media Ecology, the English of the Future. There was someone else on the program. No one seems to know who he was or what he was doing there. So never mind about that. But the talk that Postman gave was later published as a book chapter in the anthology entitled High School 1980, The Shape of the Future in American Secondary Education. It was edited by Alvin C. Eurich, and this was published in 1970, so this was looking 10 years ahead. And the title of of that chapter was The Reformed English Curriculum. And actually every chapter in that book was the Reformed something or other, like the Reformed Social Studies curriculum or the Reformed Mathematics curriculum. So this was English. And actually in that 1968 address, or the version that we know from the publication, Postman introduced media ecology as a field of inquiry that he defined as the study of media as environments. And it's worth noting that a year later in his very popular book, Teaching as a Subversive Activity, in 1969, some of us remember those days, and that was co-authored by Charles Weingartner, and there he introduced what he called the Sapir-Whorf, Korzybski, Ames, Einstein, Heisenberg, Wittgenstein, McLuhan, et al. Hypothesis that language is not merely a vehicle of expression, it is also the driver, that what we perceive and therefore can learn is a function of our languaging process. And in addition to that, in 1974, Postman gave one of the Alfred Korzybski Memorial Lectures, sponsored by the Institute of General Semantics, and it was entitled Media Ecology, General Semantics in the Third Millennium, which we're now in. Wow. And there he described media ecology as general semantics writ large. So going back to this 50th anniversary, it offers us the opportunity to take up questions such as, what has media ecology and general semantics contributed to the field of education, to teaching and schooling, what might be contributed to in the future, and what has media ecology and general semantics contributed to the study of language, to the subject of English, and what might be contributed in the future. What can we learn about Neil Postman in particular and his views on education, communication, and culture? To what extent have things changed over the past half century since that address? To what extent do they remain the same? And I'd like to introduce our panelists who are not as good as we had hoped, but no. We're just running with the joke.
You know I'm recording this.
No, our very esteemed panelists are very happy. Very happy to have them all with us, and we'll start on my left with Mike Plew, Professor of Communication at Manhattan College. Supposed to go here.
Oh, thank you very much.
Right.
What's the appropriate salutation?
Yes.
Greetings this evening.
Happy to be here.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
To his left, his boss, Tom Gencarelli.
Who made me come?
Yes, who is professor and chair of the communication department at Manhattan College, and like myself, a student, former student, and really we remain students of Neil Postman and of the gentleman to his left, but we'll let Tom go.
Oh, happy to be here. Thank you.
To his left, Terrence P. Moran. Terry, to those of us, you can't call him that, but we can. Terry was our, Tom and my professor, and Neil Postman was both his professor and his colleague, and Terry, along with Neil, started the Media Ecology program at New York University. He is retired now as Professor of Media Ecology at NYU. Is that?
I'm happy to be anywhere.
And to his left and all the way on the left is Madeline Postman. The last name is pure coincidence. Well, no. Maddie is Neil's youngest daughter, only daughter, but youngest child, and but more importantly,
Another
more
sibling here.
significantly, a teacher in the New York City school system for over 20 years, currently teaching at the Corona Arts and Sciences Academy. That's in Queens, for those of you who don't know the outer boroughs. Maddie got her BA, her bachelor's and master's from NYU, and has been teaching in the New York City school system, as I said, for 20 years, mainly in early education, which actually I never really heard much about it, but Neil taught kindergarten at some
Yeah.
point.
He started out,
So, you know, there is.
and then he went this way.
Yeah, and he went downhill from there.
Started
Maddie-
out with the tough job and then taught graduates.
Yeah,
Right.
went to the easy one.
Easy.
Maddie has been teaching kindergarten to second grade, and has also taught English as a second language to non-English speaking children. So these are our panelists, and I should.
Very glad to be here.
And as you probably know, I'm Lance Strait. I'm the president of the New York Society for General Semantics, and also do a little sideline teaching at Fordham University.
Very happy to be here.
And, well, I don't know. I'll let you know if I'm happy to be here when we're done. We'll see how.
Well, we're glad you're here.
So we're going to get started, and I'm going to thankfully sit down. And I think we'll begin, we'll kind of go in size order, or in age order, and start with Terry. You were there, right, when it all started. So I think we want to hear from you first.
Those of, well, can you hear me in the back? I'm all right, can I stay seated? Or do you need me to stand up? You're okay? Okay, I will try to keep it high enough. Those of you who know me know that I'm a fan of Western films, especially John Ford's. And one of my favorite lines is in a film called The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, and has to do with the difference between truth and, we'll call it memory. And the line that's always been used is this: when the legend becomes fact, print the legend. So what I'm going to talk to you about tonight are legends, but you can take them as facts if you like. In the beginning,
Once upon a time.
I mean, in the beginning, it was general semantics that was at the core of what became media ecology. Neil taught the courses in general semantics. I took the courses. Many other people did. But it was also tied up with, especially in my time and my experiences, with literary analysis, which Neil was very, very good at as well. I can remember very well in one of his courses, he did an exposition of Randall, no, let me think. My Papa's Waltz, which he loved to take apart and we would work it from. So in a sense, deconstructing poetry and trying to make meaning out of it, and trying to understand language and making meaning out of it, is all about what media ecology eventually became. And it had to do with adding on to those, what we knew from English, which was literature and language studies. And then I had taken a lot of courses in communication, especially with a guy named George Gordon, who was a member of this club many years, and George used to take me here to lunch a couple of times a year. It was many years with George. And George was with Charles Seepman, the founder, he came after Seepman, of an early communication program called Communication Education at NYU, right after World War II. So it was there. And then in the late 60s, middle to late 60s, when NYU, Seepman retired and they changed the whole program, they took the two biggest parts of the program, radio and television and film studies, and they moved them en masse over to the Tisch School of the Arts, where they became those two programs and departments. And what were left was some students who didn't quite fit. They were sort of media studies students. And Neil was asked to take charge of them, to get them out to graduate. We have a requirement to do that. And he asked me to help in that effort because I had taken most of the courses in the communication studies area. So we were just funneling some people through, and he was taking care of a couple of doctoral students who left over. Ed Mapp, I remember very well. You know his work? Oh, did a very good dissertation on the sort of image of the black character in American film. Very early job back in late 60s or so. It's a very nice piece of work. At any rate, in doing that, Neil and I were working, trying to devise a program called, I've forgotten the word we used before it, but it had linguistics and semantics. We were doing two things. We had a linguist named Sumner Ives, who was our super linguist. He was a technical guy. And we were trying to do this revised English curriculum to do language and looking at linguistics and semantics. And Sumner then left. And we were sort of, Neil and I worked, he knew a lot about linguistics, but wasn't terribly interested in it. And so we started to go, well, I'm dealing with all these students, why don't we just sort of move some communication stuff in here? And we had a bunch of courses that we inherited from George Gordon and Charles Seidman, and some of which I taught, and famously Neil took over one called The Communications Revolution and Culture in America. It was a 2-semester course. Nobody, and he just did what he wanted with it. And I took over a couple of different ones for Mass Mind, one of mine. Sal Falica, who's sitting there, took over that Mass Mind when I left. Mass Mind. So we inherited this stuff. We were working on it and trying to do something. At the same time, Neil was doing all of this work in trying to revise the English curriculum. And he was doing all of these textbooks on what was then called the New English. One of them was called Discovering Your Language. You know Neil and worked, did a piece on them, if I remember. Yeah. And in a sense, it just what he was doing in there with a couple of the people I worked with. Oh, let's see. Couple, and then with Howard something or other. At any rate,
Damon.
Damon, thank you. And I'm, in a way, discovering your media grew out of that. It was kind of an evolutionary thing. And we kept going to these conferences, and I was actually there. It was the first NCTE conference I went to in Milwaukee. Yes. And I'm trying to remember the name of this restaurant that you
It had to be a restaurant.
Yeah, it was a big restaurant, and the owner knew him, and there was a whole. Somehow I remember that better than all of the speeches. It wasn't half bad. It was very nice. And as we tried this program, this MA and PhD program in studies in linguistics and semantics, and it wasn't quite working. We weren't happy with it, and we had a few students in it, and we weren't happy with them. And so we stopped taking doctoral students, and we had some MA students, and we kept that part of the program going. And we took a year off to revise the whole thing. And in doing so, Neil was also with Charlie and a whole bunch of other people. John Culkin from Fordham later. He was at Fordham at the time, and later left the priesthood and started the Center for Understanding Media at the New School. Still going on as the media studies or something.
Culkin brought McLuhan to Fordham.
Yeah, it was an interesting time in trying to change, and we were trying to get rid of the old ways of thinking. Essentially, I think, as I saw it, and I was a student, then I was an instructor. I was the second program director. Neil was the program director for part of the year, and then he gave me the job. I didn't have my doctorate yet, so I was not a professor, and I really couldn't do it, but I was the acting director, because as Neil used to put it, he knew he was in the wrong business of running the program when he was using a Hofstra catalog to advise the students. Those are his words. And so I was there at all of these different parts, and most of when we formulated this was in a restaurant called Farouk's.
The drink was good, the food was.
Well, Neil was not much of a drinker.
Oh.
Neil was a very careful, little bit of a drinker. I once famously took him to a First Friday lunch that I used to go to with about 15 or 20, mostly Irish Americans and some Jewish Americans, where the drink was plentiful, and nobody remembered the food. But Neil liked good food, and it was around us. It was in Farouk. It was in the Jade Cockatoo. He would go to all these different places, you know. Neil didn't like formality. He liked to eat, and when he was talking, absolutely. He thought you should be eating and carrying on, which was the foundation of our great conference. He thought that's the way people should communicate. He had this old worldview of it. And we were hashing this out all the time. And I seem to remember in those days, in 67, 68 or so, there was always the question of what are we going to call whatever we're going, what are we trying to do, where are we trying to go. And Neil, he claims he got it from someone else. I didn't make it up, but the first one who ever said it to me was Neil. This idea of media ecology and seeing media as environments. And so we started this program, and when we put the thing together, the dean at the time, Dan Griffith, said to us, well, look, he said, I think you guys are out of your fucking minds. Dan talked like that. He was about 6'4". And he liked to throw his weight around. But he was a straight shooter. He said, look, I think you guys don't know what the fuck you're doing. I think you're going to fall flat on your faces, and I'm not going to give you one goddamn bit of help. But if you want to try it, go ahead. And we did. And it worked. I don't know how the hell it worked. It was a bizarre kind of thing. But part of it was we attracted wonderful students who were willing to take a chance on a program that did not know where it was going. but thought we would go in different places from where everybody else was going.
Right.
And that they were willing to come along with us on this excursion, this voyage, this discovery. There were Jacques Barzin, who was a very famous professor at Columbia, once wrote something that I always loved. He said that education consists of asking unexpected questions and getting unwanted answers. And it always struck me that what was education, the one we were dealing with, was just the opposite of that. So that's what we wanted to do, open it up. Now look, it was hell. I'm trying to think of the, Carl Rogers said about running a doctoral program, he said you have to take a certain degree of psychopathology. And we had wacko students, we had bizarre students. I mean, we had one student who once threatened to blow up the graduate office if they didn't give her what she wanted. I mean, our students were,
What did she want? Did they give it to you?
I have no idea. Didn't blow up the office. But, the students were different. They really were different. They were not like anybody else's students, and everybody knew it. And so it was this, more than anything else, more than any of the answers that we came up with, or the approaches we took, no matter, the best thing about the program, and eventually I think what killed it in the long years, was this willingness, even eagerness, to accept uncertainty, to embrace it in fact. Charlie Weingartner always used to say, people, that everything people do of trying to create the illusions of certainty in an uncertain cosmos. And I thought we embraced that. And in the great days of the Media Ecology program at NYU, it worked. And it worked for a long time. And unfortunately, when Neil died, and Chris retired, I was left alone with a bunch of people who didn't have the courage to be wrong, didn't have the courage to not know, didn't have the courage to accept that their students might know more than they did. That was the end of Media Ecology and New York University.
Here, here.
Very good.
Well, I want to say thank you to Terry, and I'm also thankful that I don't have to go after that. So Tom does.
And it's all down to well, I wasn't there. I showed up a little bit later, and even later than Lance. And my introduction to the educational reform movement was Neil's book, Teaching as a Conserving Activity, which had a marked influence on everything I've done since. But also made me go back to read Teaching as a Subversive Activity, which came out right in the thick of it. And so, not having been there and hearing about and learning about this time, what I think about is, in a way, the educational reform movement never ended. It continues to go on. And while that might sound like a happy and positive thing, that is not my intent. That's not what I mean. We have at my college a school of education and health. I don't know if we're going to wind up naming it like when you had CNAP, right? The School of Education, Nursing, Health, and Arts Professions.
And drug use.
We may just stop at education and health, but we have a group of folks who I think are representative of what's happened in the professionalization of colleges and schools of education all around the country. And this idea that, we're not doing well enough with the old model. We're not doing well enough with the existing model. We have to come up with improvements, and we have to do research and, push the envelope and push the discipline of teaching young people further. We have to help them learn more, learn better. And so, at my college, when we have events and the Apple representatives come to campus, these people get all giddy and excited because they can't wait to see the new products that, this technology company is offering us in the name of educational media and educational technology. There's a publishing company, or at least it was a publishing company. Many of you probably know the name Pearson. And I certainly understand them trying to negotiate their business model moving into the future when we think about whether or not we're becoming post-literate as a culture, when we deal with the fact that students don't necessarily buy textbooks, and by the way, they're greatly overpriced. I always talk to the students about the fact that if you go to Europe and buy a textbook from a US-based publishing company, it costs less. And how does that make sense when you have to, put it on a container and ship it over there? Wouldn't it cost more? But in negotiating this future business model to try to salvage what their company is and might become or has to become, they've gone into the business of doing educational technology, not just to help us in the classroom, and as a matter of fact, with Pearson, not really to help us in the classroom, but to provide institutions with platforms and applications that they will license and spend a great deal of money on, to do the jobs that, we try as faculty to do face-to-face. Well, Pearson, my point in using Pearson as an example is, have you seen the Terminator movies with, you know, Arnold Schwarzenegger? What's the name of the company?
Skynet.
Yeah, Pearson's educational technology business, and this came up in a chairs meeting with my dean, and we all just looked at each other, our jaws dropped. The company subsidiary is called Sky Factor. And, you know, so these kinds of things are going on, and I am reminded that what happened with the original idea of an educational reform movement, well, I'll say it this way. We are, Lance and I and Mike too, friends and colleagues with a woman named Renee Hobbs, name some of you might know, and she comes from, she is one of the movers and shakers in really what's a kind of a grassroots intellectual movement that is known as media literacy. We like to call it media education. Media literacy, people say, well, you get a media education in order to become media literate. Media ecologists say literacy is print and written language based. Josh Meyerowitz, a colleague of ours, you know, said in terms of classes like reading the film, he said, you know, no one watches a book. And so with respect to the media literacy movement, I wrote a paper a while ago where I said that media ecology is the origins of this media literacy and media education movement. And it is in the book that Neil wrote as primary author for the National Council of Teachers of English, teaching television and the teaching of English, which came out in 1960. And it came out in the face of the fact that the turn of that decade of the 50s into 60s is when television really took hold in U.S. culture. It's about the same time that Daniel Boorstin wrote his great book, The Image, and talked about how, you know, we were facing a shift from a print, literate, cultural frame of mind to what would become a culture of the image and what would threaten to become a post-literate culture. And so media literacy then becomes even that much more problematic a term, because what media ecology as educational theory has always been about, as media education, is about conserving and preserving that literate tradition and all of the gifts that it's brought to us. And of course, that's where general semantics comes in, because it is all about language, yes, oral language and written language, but how it came to fruition with the invention of the printing press and all of the learning and knowledge that came with, you know, the Renaissance and the Enlightenment and those gifts of the printing press. And so, again, it really is about the fact that Neil came out of English language education at Teachers College at Columbia University, and really understanding the idea of English language education as the basic blueprint for everything that we should be doing. And as, you know, as I stand and look at things moving forward, and these continued attempts at reform for the sake of reform and jumping on the bandwagon of trying to do better, you know, I think we need to borrow McLuhan's words, look into the rearview mirror and realize what we have forsaken on, you know, this journey forward. And so that's
I just want to note in that respect, because, you know, we often don't think about the year 1960, and the same year that Neil Postman publishes his first book, Television and the Teaching of English, is the year that Marshall McLuhan hands in his report on understanding new media, which, you know, many have puzzled what it was the U.S. Department of Education at that time, what in the world they made out of that, but that became the basis of the book, McLuhan's book, Understanding Media. So and it really does bring out the fact that this goes back a long ways, and that 1960 was perhaps a more significant year than we give credit to.
And that the book that comes out before Understand Media finally comes out in 1964 as a trade book is the Gutenberg Galaxy.
Yeah. So it's something that we gives us another anniversary that we can celebrate in a couple of years. And speaking of anniversaries, I'd like to turn to Professor Clue, also of Manhattan College, for his comments.
Thank you. I always feel just a little bit self-conscious in situations like this because it's not uncommon for me to be in the company of a lot of people who knew Dr. Postman personally. And I always feel somewhat embarrassed and reluctant to call him Neil, although everyone around me tends to call him Neil, having known him. I feel like an adopted member of the family and very grateful for it. There's no way to begin for me, and except to sort of be somewhat autobiographical without being self-indulgent, which is a little bit of a trick. But I didn't arrive in this environment straight through without some bumps in the road. And I was a young person who loved school and really had a passion for being in school and for learning, particularly language. And eventually fell out of love with school and sort of followed the path through my undergraduate work because that's what one is supposed to do, although I didn't enjoy it very much at all, and went into industry, working in media industries, before eventually feeling something empty in my life in my mid-20s. And living in Brooklyn at the time, I was fortunate enough to live around the corner from a little bookstore. It's still there, but there are a few of them left. And I'd browse occasionally on the weekends and picked up 2 books one day. One of them was a book by the physicist Michio Kaku, and the other was a book called Technopoly by Dr. Neil Postman. And I first opened the book by Michio Kaku and was, I hope he doesn't see this, excuse me, Professor Kaku, but wasn't particularly impressed with the book and didn't make it through very far and put it down. Said, let's give this guy Postman a try, and I really have never looked back since. And for me, the journey begins with sort of an intellectual and a personal kindred for the voice that appeared in the books, and it eventually led me to study with Lance and to become an associate and a friend with a lot of the people in this room. And for that, I'm eternally grateful. I think one of the things that turned me on to the work, beyond feeling that kindred spirit, sort of the wit and the love of language and the turn of a phrase and the ideas in Technopoly, was that I continued to pursue down the line to a number of books, including Teaching as a Subversive Activity and The Soft Revolution and Teaching as a Conserving Activity, and so on and so on. And each one I picked up, I felt compelled to read cover to cover until I couldn't keep my eyes open any longer. And I knew I was in the right place. And for me, it was that connection to someone who loved language, someone who loved other humans, and someone who thought in a really sophisticated but grounded way that that made me think I need to be a part of this too. And I think it's infrequent that I come in contact with people who are so expressive of their humanity and their love for humanity, and for the intellectual rigor that goes along with thinking through things the way that I know general semanticists and media ecologists do. But it was a great gift to me, and it's one of the motivations I have to hopefully give that gift back to others who may have lost that spark for learning. I think it's important to be in love with language. I think it's important to be in love with, the other people around us, even if you don't know those people. And for me, speaking of general semantics, speaking of media ecology, and speaking of the education reform movement, I think one of the things that's lost is this wonderful idea that Neil had about what's the purpose of a public school. It's to serve a public. And not only to serve a public, but perhaps to create a public, to give shape and form and purpose to a public. And I wonder what we mean by that in the 21st century, when we've lost the sense of the private, when everything is a public, or when we serve so many publics. And that I often turn, in my confusion about that issue and about that kind of language, to James W. Carey, who talked a lot about the link between community and communication. I mean, I teach in a department of communication, as many people do in this room, or have been around departments of communication. Certainly general semantics and its attachment to language is a science of communication. And I like the word community in that respect. And what are the needs of our communities? I fear that one of the things we've done that requires a new sort of reform is that our communities have become too broad and too incoherent, and that, is Dunbar's number 140, the anthropologist who studied primates, and he said the largest number of groups, the largest number of primates that could form a coherent social group was 140. They depended on grooming one another to maintain social relations. I don't know where we are with respect to, yeah, thank you. He does this frequently for me, that's why I love him so much. But I don't know the material well enough to know how this translates into the human experience, except to say, how do we maintain relationships? I mean, how many Facebook friends do we have, and how many, acquaintances and networks do we have? If that number is anywhere close to what humans are capable of maintaining in any sort of coherent and reasonable way, how do we return to that in a way that we root education in the needs and the hopes and the dreams of smaller groups of people who are parts of those larger groups again? And I don't know all the answers to that, except that I tend to think that in terms of abstraction, as we've abstracted ourselves out into larger and larger environments, that reversing the process to ground ourselves in mindfulness as individuals and in quality human relationships that serve specific questions and needs and so forth is the only way that we survive in any meaningful and loving way with other human beings. I don't know where we'll go with this conversation beyond that, but that's what's brought me here, and it's what drives me and gives me purpose in the work that I do. And I'm thankful for all of you for being here, because I feel it's inseparable, the things that I think about and the feelings I have for all the people that help me think through them.
Good answer. That's what we
Good answer.
So we passed him.
Survey says.
Yes. We'll turn now to Maddie, who, unlike the rest of us, is actually a teacher. And one that follows the difficult path of teaching the very youngest of us.
Thank you. You guys talk so eloquently, so I had to bring this to read, if you don't mind me reading from some notes. Hello, everyone. Good evening. I'm Madeline Postman. I'm Neil Postman's daughter. When Lance asked me to join this panel, I was very honored. My brothers Mark and Andy have been on panels, so this is very new for me. While I am flattered, I'm also concerned. What are my qualifications? I have never read Korzybski. However, I do reread my dad's books. Maybe more important, as Lance has said a few times this evening, I have been teaching in the New York City schools for more than 20 years, so I have a great deal of experience educating younger children, primarily kindergarten through the 5th grade. Some of my fond memories of my dad are when I was in NYU. As Lance said, I have a bachelor's degree in dramatic literature and a master's in educational theater. And I had the pleasant experience to be with the sports elves. I'm sure you knew Nancy and Lowell, and those other, Constantine Giorgio. I'm trying to think of some other professors. It was just a wonderful experience. So I'd often drop in to see my dad in his office, and he was usually surrounded by students and colleagues. And I remember seeing Terry, Casey Lum, Chris Nystrom, Sal Falica from time to time. My father once said, children enter schools as question marks and leave as periods. For him, learning how to ask important questions was the essence of a good education. In the article that we're discussing tonight, the Reformed English Curriculum, my dad poses more than 100 questions for us to ponder. The article, which was written before 1970, contemplates a future curriculum for students in the late 20th century. Now here we are contemplating a curriculum in the 21st century. In the article, my father questioned what we would do in a time when students know more than their teachers, and I think we're there. My father's words continue to be relevant today, and they resonate with me as I teach. For example, in my own experience with the young children who often cry during the first days of school, I know that music can be comforting. I have sometimes played for them the song Getting to Know You from the musical The King and I. And one of my favorite lyrics from the songs, from this particular song, which echo my dad's observations, and forgive me if I don't sing it. It's a very ancient saying, but a true and honest thought, that if you become a teacher, by your pupils you'll be taught. My dad had an experience along these lines when he was a grad student at Columbia University. He had a job teaching English at the High School of Performing Arts. And on one occasion he was teaching a Shakespeare play, and he was assigned a separate role to each of the students in the class, and one for himself. So they prepared to read an act together, and when he looked up from his book, he noticed he was the only one in the room reading from the book. His students, many of whom were budding actors and performers, had all memorized their lines. Even as a mother of a 6-year-old, I am surprised at how much I learned from him. My son Maxwell discovered when he was very young that he was fascinated by elevators. I read him every storybook that I could find about elevators. We both learned that without elevators there would be no skyscrapers, and without skyscrapers there would be no cities like the one we now inhabit. So I was delighted to learn these facts together with my son. More than learning facts, I gained through him a new way of looking at the world. And another relevant example is the school I'm currently teaching at right now, is the Corona Arts and Science Academy in Corona. And they had parent-teacher conference night last night. So for the first time in my teaching experience, the conferences were not led by, when you went to school, your mom, your dad would go and speak to the teacher, and it was just the two of them. Well, last night, for the first time, it was student-led conferences instead of teacher-led. The student initiates the questions and issues to be discussed. They prepare a portfolio which shows their strengths and weaknesses in their learning. And as they articulate their struggles and achievements to their teacher and parent, they gain confidence and learn how to be self-reflective. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to witness it, but I heard some wonderful things by the principal saying it was a great learning experience for the principal, for the teachers, and they are going to try to continue with that, and they think that it'll be a trend in public schools. So these days, when so many students are dependent on technology and social media, I think that it's especially important to develop the skills to speak for yourself, to literally speak out loud and make your argument. Even very young students benefit from the traditional lesson of show and tell for the same reason. And lastly, one final note about how this learning environment has changed from the one that my dad taught 50 years ago was when I started teaching, kindergarten children had nap time daily, right? Well, nowadays there's no nap time, and now they have homework. My son, who was in kindergarten last year, he's now in first grade, he used to come home with a packet like this, okay? He's doing, right now he's in a dual language program, so he's getting instruction in Spanish and English. So he would bring home a packet of maybe 3 or 4 pages of math, 3 or 4 pages of reading, and then another 3 or 4 pages of Spanish. And the homework would be in Spanish. So that's what they're doing now. But, so, what I would like to add is, in many ways, there is more emphasis on what we know above all else. So I would like, my suggestion is I would like to reinstate nap time. Except this time around, I would include the teacher. I think my father would approve. Thank you, Lance, for inviting me to join you and this panel. It's a privilege to be with many of you who knew my dad personally, or those who know him through his writing. Thank you.
Yeah, you say this, I can't help but recalling that in teaching is a conserving activity, and Postman is giving the statistics about how children spend more time watching television than in school, doing anything else except sleeping. And he has a line that says, which may be the real hidden curriculum. Ah. Well, I'd like to, perhaps, take up that initial proposal that Media Ecology replace high school English, which the word that just comes to mind for me is chutzpah, to propose that. It obviously, as far as I know, no English teachers lost their jobs on account of that. Terry can correct me if I'm wrong. Was that, I mean, is that crazy, or is media ecology something that could be taught in, I mean, we do it to a greater or lesser extent in college, and started going back to graduate programs and now as undergraduates. Could it be taught in lower levels? Is it something that should be
Neil
taught?
certainly believed it. And I don't see why it couldn't be. I think where we failed was in trying to change the English establishment. Hell, you couldn't even get them off that Latin Greek. You couldn't budge them. I mean, they just didn't want to be budged. So rationality didn't work. God knows, Neil spent a lot of time in different places where they had the what was the PEP called? Postman Enthusiast Program down in Maryland.
Yeah, Instant Pet, we have that, I mean, you can download it from,
Yeah, I mean, he went,
from our
there was
website.
a whole movement in Arizona that he was involved with, where they were trying to make this media literacy or media awareness as the curriculum. I mean, to me, it's always been part of the same thing. And I think, Neil, I learned this from Neil. It's building curriculum and individuals about everything in your environment that will enhance or impede your chances of survival. And Neil went survival, physical survival, social survival, psychological survival, moral survival, name it, whatever you want.
I just want to interrupt you.
My wife.
Excuse me.
All the time. So this is not unusual, but with my experience, I was in the program with Neil and Terry and Chris, and the thing was, you liberated us. We came through, on a master's level, we came through an English program, as Terry said, where it was read all the stuff, whether you wanted to or not. It gave us a great background. But Neil and that group liberated us. As a result, we felt we could do anything. We felt we could accomplish anything. And we felt sorry for all of those CAS students who were English majors and trapped in this regimen. And Neil gave us courage, I think, So, I mean, I came from a creative background, and he encouraged that, even though he sent me to what he thought was the worst school, which is, in Manhattan, to teach, which I am eternally grateful to him for. It was an incredible experience. I'll send that girl from Riverdale. So, that's what I got out of the program. It was what you were saying. It was different. We felt different. We felt good. We felt smart. And we were a ragtag group of students, too. All very willful and very independent. And we were brought together by the program to think, to think creatively and productively. And it was amazing what we all accomplished.
And did you get to use that in your own teaching?
Absolutely.
We had a lot of, in the beginning, because we're in the Department of English Education, we attracted a lot of English and social studies teachers who needed to get master's degrees to keep their licenses. And so we trained a lot, hundreds, many hundreds of secondary and intermediate school teachers, and all of whom tried to bring into the classroom some of the principles. And again, I would stress, it wasn't so much the ideas, but the way of learning, as Neil would call it.
Well, Maddie
That
was
open-ended
ahead,
inquiry method that he loved, that questions were tremendously important, and everyone had something to contribute. And we always believed our students knew frequently much more than we did about, and that was part of
You
what we did.
trusted us.
Well, you could do it with kids too. I mean, I think I was an intermediate English teacher for 2 years while I was studying under Neil, and I used a lot of that stuff, the inquiry method, and ways of doing it. It can be done.
You're talking about process-oriented guided inquiry learning, POGL, what's now called POGL. There's an actual system in the world today
Yeah.
called process-oriented guided inquiry learning, POGL.
Well, that's what Neil, they called it back in the sixties.
Yeah, well, if Neil never really liked methodologies. Those of us who studied for our doctorates know what a pain it was to get him to focus on methodology. And he, in fact, would frequently celebrate what he would say, like, who the hell can say what Jacques-Ellul's methodology is? or Langer's, or McLuhan's, or, it didn't get reduced to those things. We had colleagues, very bright people in our department, who were into methodologies. They were always trying to give us a methodology and say, look, what you're trying to do is this. Here's this will do it. This formula. And Neil always resisted that. Although, that's all I can say. He was a great resistor. But those of us who had to get our doctorates, we had to have a methodology to convince the other professors of it. If they were going to give us a doctorate.
I remember Jay Rosen taking a class in philosophical methods.
Right.
Like, wow, what's that about? And I tried to take it when it was my turn. You had to take a methods course,
Right.
and then a general, and I tried to take it and it wasn't offered. And I was like, oh, come on, what is a series of philosophical methods we're gonna learn over 15 weeks? Because again, it's what Jacques Ellul does, and it's what Neil did, and it's what Langer did.
Well, I mean, I did it too, and I mean, that was my method, and it was just, but it was just, here are some books I'm gonna read, here are some questions I'm gonna ask about the books, but I may ask more, but you know what? I mean, those of you that have been here before know that I've been kind of strict about not taking questions from the audience and until later on, and having time for the panel. But I think it would be in the spirit of what we're talking about today to depart from that, since you see these hands going up, and I know you have a question for us, yeah.
looking-
No, well, I was.
Oh,
It's
I
a
was
quick
actually gonna
question.
start with the
It's very
unlisted.
basic. I was just hoping that maybe a few of you could spend some time unpacking Postman's conception of the media ecology and what that really means, really. Yeah, just like a sort of introduction would be great.
in a
We're all
second.
standing on one foot.
If you don't mind.
Who wants to start?
Lance, mine is an easier question. Actually, it's
Not
not a
that difficult.
question. I just want,
Not that
Let's
difficult.
Shelley,
And
we'll come back to
and
your
then you-
question,
We will,
and let's get Shelley.
Lance is questioning whether it's appropriate for Neil, you use the word chutzpah.
Yes.
he had the, well, you know he had
Yeah.
chutzpah. But from Terry's description of the early days, and I heard them too, that department was formed but because of chutzpah. Without that, you wouldn't have it. So I think it's very appropriate. That's all I want to say. For those who don't know what chutzpah means, you haven't lived in New York long enough.
I'm part of that philosophical method school.
I would not ever have tried to say what Neil Postman meant by anything, other than
Neither did I.
his, read him. And if you've read enough of Neil, and even if you just read 2 books, if you read Teaching as Subversive Activity that he wrote with Charlie, and then Teaching as Conserving Activity,
That took
which
a lot
he-
of chutzpah.
as-
And he
as
got a
Neil-
lot of
well, as Neil
criticism
put
for it.
Charlie used to say that at the end of every one of their books, they should have written this sentence, or vice versa.
Yeah.
Right.
They-
It was Charlie's view of the
Right.
world. And Neil said that book was, and to a large extent, it was a kind of reversal, which means he changed his mind.
Yes.
Neil was not.
Who does that?
Well, he used to.
Publicly.
He used to always say about Korzybski that one of his problems, why people had trouble reading him, that he was given to rather bad puns, talking about categorical thinking was for cats and dogmatic thinking was for dogs. Well, that's part of it. Neil was not categorical or dogmatic. He had an ability I've rarely encountered in anyone else. Neil never connected himself to his ideas. And if you attacked his ideas, he did never saw it as an attack on him. Now, the rest of us have a hard time not doing that. But he could see it. He could put the damn idea there. And some student would be really ripping into him in class, and I would be getting upset and saying, listen to that stupid jerk, and he'd say, well, I don't know, I think he's wrong, but I want to hear what he has to say. I'm thinking about what he's saying. And that ability, which he always attributed to his training in general semantics, which he got from Lou Clydesdale, that is, he distanced himself. Not only is the word not the thing, but the words are not me. They're outside of me. Ideas are outside of me. So that's why I have a hard time with the question of what did Neil mean? He meant different things at different times. And if you look at his work, it's kind of shifts and it moves around. There are chords there. There are certain fundamental principles that he laid out about how to think about media. Not what. But this seems like a good set of questions to ask. I think Neil must have asked more questions than any writer.
Well, it's very Talmudic. And asking questions, as Maddie quoted. I love that children start out in school as question marks and they finish as periods. That's not the way it's supposed to be, I think.
Well, one thing Maddie gave me today was an explanation of why kids cry when they're taken to school. Now they have reason to cry every day.
That's right. When we grow up, we
Well, I think keeping with general semantics, they should end up as an ellipsis, which is the equivalent of an et cetera.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean
But
to take over your question.
I do want to provide an answer to it, and that in that initial talk, I think it's the best definition of media ecology is the study of media as environments. Of course, it leaves open the question of what the hell do we mean by any of this, but talking about it as environments gives us a way to think about media's effects, because if we think of it as cause-effect, it doesn't feel right. But if we think of it as we're in this room is a medium, it's an environment that shapes the way that we communicate and the way that we think about ourselves and all kinds of things. And in the same way, this is being recorded, the recording which will be on YouTube is a different kind of environment which will have a different kind of influence on how we understand and experience the content. And I think that was, the fundamental point. And in the way that Terry said, it's the way we do things. I think that's fundamental, and that's, goes back to when McLuhan said the medium is the message, which is, sort of like really the starting point. It really means how we do things is the basis of everything else. To ask, what's the way that we're doing it will tell you everything else, or will give you the entry into everything else about who we are, what we're doing, why we're doing it. I think that becomes, sort of the basis. Do you want to add to that?
Of especially your use of the medium as the message. So that aphorism, that phrase suggests that all media have their biases with respect to what they present to us and what they leave out, what we can learn and know, and what they're not necessarily good at providing. And one of McLuhan's intellectual forebears is Harold Innis. And with respect to the idea of ecology coming from the study of the natural environment as balance, Innis' main lesson in his two books was that if a civilization or a culture has a predisposition to one medium over all others, that contained within that predisposition, that bias, is the seeds of its collapse. And so what can we do to ameliorate that problem? Well, strike a balance and realize that it's necessary for us to recognizing bias, try to become informed through all possible media, sitting around and talking with informed, and smart and cool people, as well as reading books and, paying attention to the kind of media environment that we are living in 2018. Interestingly enough, though, and this goes back to my first remarks, with respect to reading, I don't know if in this point has ever really worked for me, because the only problem that arises out of being a reader and engaging with print-based language is if we read all the time and thus become antisocial people who don't interact. But the bias of print and all of what has been carried down to us from the Greeks and Romans too in Western civilization, when print reintroduced it all to us and brought it back and started the conversation all over again. That's the one place where for me, and it's always drop the football.
And I kind of wanted, you led in a direction that I was thinking a bit as well, and I think that's important, and this is a very useful way to think about this in a general semantics environment, is that there's a difference, and there's a really important difference between learning about media ecology and learning through the experience of media ecology. And general semantics has been good at this because there's been a very strong sort of practitioner's wing, almost a sort of therapeutic sense of what general semantics is that we can train ourselves to be conscious of abstraction, and that there are exercises to be done to do general semantics in addition to reading about general semantics. And I think the typical experience that many people who went through media ecology in whichever way they encountered media ecology was to read books and have conversations with people about media ecology. This is a media ecologist, and his or her ideas are media ecological, and to sort of read them and talk about them and commune around them, and then have a series of personal epiphanies, I think. And that's certainly the way that I encountered it. But one of the things that I think is interesting in terms of the Postman legacy, and in terms of the way I think about reform in education, is how is it that if we intend to replace English with media ecology, or if we intend to replace anything in education with media ecology, the idea is, how do you do media ecology, and how do you create those epiphanies through experience beyond reading and talking? Now, those things will, of course, always be an important part of it. It's complicated stuff, and it requires endurance and determination and love and passion for the material, and a willingness to sort of think where there are no answers perhaps to be found except in the journey and these kinds of things. But I've spent some time thinking about how is it that one brings about these kinds of epiphanies in people, and I found a few myself, but I don't know that anyone has systematized them in our education system anywhere, except I was always very fascinated by Fritjof Capra, the physicist, who's based largely out of Berkeley, who, working in kind of the tradition of Gregory Bateson, was interested in building a systems thinking or systems perspective in students through something he helped define called the Census of Equal Literacy. And he does things like students will have gardens at their schools and learn how an ecology works in terms of that biosphere ecology. And then the students will eat the food that they produce and so forth. And I think there's a lot of interesting epiphanies that come out of seeing how our food comes from a place, and that place requires interactions with other parts of the environment, including human labor and the mosquitoes and all these other things. I think there are a series of ways that people have attempted to foster that systems thinking in people. And I don't know what comes first, the chicken or the egg, because I only know whichever, the chicken or the egg, that I experienced was reading the books and talking to people and having personal epiphanies about my own life and experiences and so forth. But I do think there's this interesting flow that goes in the other direction, that if we think appropriately about how to give people these experiences, to turn them into systems thinkers, that the ideas we find in the complicated texts and conversations around learning about media ecology suddenly become natural, right? Is that we have a natural experience that leads us to understand the more complicated texts. And I think that's an interesting experiment that perhaps means something related to reform, although I'm not sure what.
Okay. I do want to just note, part of what you're saying is the aha experience, and that was one of the problems going back to McLuhan, it's sort of like either you get it or you don't get it, which is, I think, something that not so much Postman, but more Christine Nystrom really tried to address by actually trying to systematize media ecology as something that could be taught. I do think, when you talk about educators, Paulo Freire comes to mind as someone, a kind of contemporary of Postman's in the educational reform movement, who tried to put into practice dialogue as opposed to, and this is where, speaking to Tom's point, the bias of reading is, the downside of that is education by the book. We were talking before the panel about a professor who taught his class by reading from his own book. And I remember hearing an undergraduate professor of mine from Nigeria saying how American professors don't seem to want to engage students in debate, and instead say, well, it's in the book, read the book. So I think that kind of authoritarian quality is a downside. It's also why McLuhan said that sort of the cost, if you like, or the price we pay for literacy is propaganda. And that's Lul's point. In all the modern societies, in order to propagandize their populations, engaged in literacy campaigns. The old Soviet Union, China. Because if people are not literate, you can't reach them through propaganda. Which also includes thinking in an abstract term, something general semantics tries to address, and it leads to the madness of Don Quixote, right? Don Quixote's madness was from reading too many books. It's the first kind of critique of that. But Jim Marousas has had his hand up. I'd like to give him a chance.
First of all, I find this fascinating. I was a student when you were teaching at NYU, but I wasn't. So in 1968, I'm 20, and I'm guessing you're just a little older than 20. And there's a big difference right at that time between graduate students and professors and the students. It was almost like the Great Divide in America. And it was really, we were completely not like you. And we're looking for something from you. And I believe, I don't mean you personally, and on the other side of the coin, you were saying there's something going on here, what can I do and how can I help? That's a mutual thing. And so, because I remember, I was at City College, and the 60s were interesting, to say the least. And there's a few, there's a few things that first of all, I love Postman, but I'm not a Postman guy. I've read some of his books. In fact, I'm sending out now to everybody I know 3 pages from The Disappearance of Childhood, where he talks about the telegraph, because I actually want to have conversations about the telegraph in 21st century America, because it's easier to look back. And what he says about the telegraph in 1980, if I took out the word telegraph and put in social media, it would be exactly the same thing. If that's the case, it's a mistake to be looking at social media for being the place where the problems are. And the telegraph is the same. Kierkegaard writes anxiety, the concept of anxiety, 10 years after the telegraph comes out. And social media is nothing but anxiety on one level. So there's something coming on here. But what I find interesting is McLuhan's, so there was a book called Understanding Fiction, or Fiction, a book called Understanding Poetry. And McLuhan's book, Understanding Media, was supposed to be the 3rd book. So McLuhan never for a second didn't think that this was literary. And one suggestion is, if that's true, and if he used literature and poetry to understand media, and if we're living in a media sort of saturated world, why aren't we trying to use media, the understanding of media, to go back and read poetry and literature? And the question then becomes, and I'm very confused because I don't know, I don't really know what media ecology is the way you're using it. So one of the things I would love for you to do is, I'm in the 10th grade, and you're teaching a class, and you're saying this is media, and I'm going to teach, and this is what we're going to talk about. And what I keep hearing in the back of my mind, and McLuhan has the one book, The Mechanical Bride. Tons of questions, tons of content, tons of moral judgments, etc. And then he's got Understanding Media. And understanding media is this dance of media. So the way you would understand media in McLuhan's terms would be go back to T.S. Eliot and see what T.S. Eliot's talking about in terms of the tradition, and how does every great work of art change the tradition while preserving it. And in that context, how does every great innovation change the world and yet preserve it? And I don't hear the preserving. So when you were speaking, the quote that came out over and over again to me, and I think this is the quote that parents need to remember: the child is the father to the man. And I think what that quote means is the child will always ask the parent, this is what I need. And the parent, I think, always says, how am I supposed to give that to you? And what happens is the parent has to grow up. And we're now at a context where it looks like everything your dad was saying is true. The children are more mature in kindergarten than the teachers are. And the conferences are led by these mature adults, while the teacher is saying something like, but you need to be a kid, right? So the question is, how do you teach kid? No, not the kids. The subject is kid. How do you teach kid? When I was younger, right, and I was going to school, my mother would not let me do homework. If it was a beautiful day outside and I was doing homework, she would say, Jim, what are you doing inside? Go out and play. And that, in that context, was an understanding of the world, which is completely different than what I'm hearing you guys talk about. So the 2 points is, it's the 10th grade, you're teaching the class, how do you teach this? You're walking in and what are you talking about? And then 2, what about the moral dimension? What has not changed? I mean, even this idea of reading, unless I'm wrong, unless I'm wrong, reading until very recently was done by our ears. So you're talking about the Jewish, and the Jewish shuls, It's the cantor who's doing the reading and everyone's listening. In the church, the reading is done by the singers because there are no books. So up until very recently, reading is not visual detachment, but a real type of dramatic participation. And I think there's a dance that needs to be opened up between what McLuhan was trying to do, and there's very little aha in his teaching. It's more like, I don't know if you remember, but Bob Dylan, when he used to come out with these albums in the 60s, there were no liner notes, there was no one talking about them, and you'd hear these songs and you had no clue what was being said, but you knew these were very important and you would play them 10, 15, 20 times until you got the words. And the thing about McLuhan in the 60s, and I think Postman, is you didn't really know what they were saying, but you knew it was important. So the thing I think you need to start teaching people is how to be in the presence of something you don't understand and know it's important, versus being in the presence of something you think you understand that is busy selling you out, right? And that would mean, then I could keep, it's not, but that's the stuff. So the simple thing is, because I don't know what you mean, change the curriculum. We're in a high school or an elementary school. And McLuhan wrote a book on this, the City as School, where he said the way you teach technology is you take it away. So what's the impact of the cell phone on all you kids? I know what we'll do. Let's do a little thought experiment. You don't have a cell phone. What are you doing with your lives? And they all go, ah. And whatever that ah is the meaning of the technology. That's the way he taught it. It's a really good book. And so curriculum, if you could, like one teaching, and not hard. Just like a simple idea. Do you walk in and say, has anybody watched TV today? Do you walk in and say, have you noticed the last 3 days you haven't had one thought that's your own in your head? I don't know how you do it. What would be like a class?
There actually is an answer to that. It actually ties what you're saying to what Tom is asking here. And you brought it up when you mentioned the Jewish cantor. It's more actually the Jewish student who's reading a line that says a woman is married with a date. And the person opposite him is saying, but a date is not worth a penny in one city, and the other guy says, but it's worth a penny in the other city. The question is, if she goes to one city and she's married, where it's worth a penny, she goes to the other city and she's not married because it's not worth a penny. They're both doing literacy. They're both going back to reading. Oh, but it takes two of them. It's not just one person reading on his own. You ask her if you'd be worried about the flies in the garden. Don't be worried about them. Let the guy read with a partner. Have a partner. And then the literacy is restored. I actually have a question.
Actually, the dialogue is restored.
The dialogue is restored, and you all will come from a generation where there was no social media.
Why don't we give the folks a chance to respond to Jim?
Okay, I'll respond to Jim. Sorry, I beg your pardon.
No, if you want to.
You put a lot of stuff in there. Let me just respond to one part of that you're thinking about, which is connected to Neil and the way he thought about literature and the way he used literature in his teaching and the way what he valued. And it was the work of I.A. Richards.
Sure.
And the work of Louise Rosenblatt, Literature's Exploration, which is that literature doesn't mean anything. It is. And it's an experience. It's, if you like, it's an environment in which different people look. Just because we're all in the same environment, we're not all the same, and we're not all being affected by the environment the same way. We each are affected differently, and because we are different. And certainly with interpreting literature, nobody's looking for an absolute meaning of anything, at least none of us. But that's also, so when you're dealing with what Neil liked to make the distinction that Suzanne Langer did between discursive and non-discursive communication, discursive being largely what we would call science or technology, something really, this is or it is not. Very, very Aristotelian, I guess.
Digital.
Yeah. As opposed to non-discursive, which is most of what the hell we do in our lives. it's something what Malinowski distinguished between emphatic communication and static communication. One is easier to interpret than the other, but the emphatic is much more important because it's what holds the system together. So when you try to understand how a poem means, it's different from, it's not, it means, what does it mean to you is another question. So this is a process, right? And Neil, I think, used that, because he certainly, I was in classes where he taught poetry this way. And he signed the books, so I know what I was doing with him. And I think he thought about media the same way. That we're not gonna say, no, let's take a book where he does talk about the effects of media. Disappearance of childhood, right? Neil insists in that book that television, talking about a couple of things, but mostly television, has destroyed the idea of childhood in America in give me the date on it.
79.
Thank you.
What the book, this book,
Well,
Yeah,
82.
82.
Okay, so he's talking about roughly the, when television was the mass medium in American life, infected. And he had this, he had an argument that he thought it was doing away with childhood. The whole time he was doing this, I was arguing with him the opposite. I kept saying, no, it's elongating childhood. It's getting rid of it. It's turning it into everything.
Infantilized.
That the adults, and I would say, when I was a kid, the only people wearing baseball uniforms were the people on the field. And then later, some little leaguers. Now I go to baseball games, and all the damn adults are wearing baseball uniforms. And I look around, and I think these people are crazy because they don't want to grow up. Well, and Neil made a little, in the last chapter, he sort of gave me a little bit of notice on that. We didn't, in the sense, it could be vice versa.
So what does it look like to grow up today? I mean, what does grown up look like? I guess that's
I don't
another-
know.
I know.
I mean,
I know.
he was influenced by, the whole idea of what childhood was as a social invention, and that, that childhood didn't exist at one time, and then it was socially. So it's changing. I would say this: there are no certainties, and the explorations go on. I can't think of any other way of doing it. Now, for me, the study of literature has always been part of what I do when I'm thinking about media, and so I always see it that way. It's the same sort of problem. And I mean, so the question is not what does I don't know, pick a book. What does Ulysses mean? More importantly is what happens.
Why not pick an easy book?
We don't know.
What does Ulysses mean, Terry?
What's important is, why the hell do so many of us spend a hunk of our lives reading that book and rereading it and meeting with people and reading it together and being on stage and performing it? I'm part of a group that does it every year.
Oh, good.
Why do we do this? That's what's, Joyce created something out of that. The book is not important, it's what the hell we're doing with it. And the book becomes a way of binding a group together.
Community, like
Right.
Mike
Right,
said.
exactly.
There are all sorts of stuff going on there. They're much more important than, what does this thing mean? How many lines are in here? What does this thing, and you can, if you keep reading it, you keep listening to people talking about it and writing about it, there's a lot to learn. And Joyce was very happy. He said, the book was gonna keep scholars busy for a long while, and Finnegan's Wake was gonna drive them really crazy, because they'll never get out of that one. But the point is, the doing of it is what does it. So, I mean, when we do one thing on Broadway, at Symphony Space, every 16th of June, the thing is what's important. We're not doing it to know the book. We're doing it for what it does. And
experience.
and I think all of our, that's why, if you think of media as environments, as part of culture, if you like, as culture. I mean, if instead of using the word culture, people don't have a hard time with culture, which is no one knows what the hell culture means. There's no definition of culture that anyone agrees with. But we all in a sense, well, yeah, I got a kind of sense of it. Well, in that sense, if you think of it that way, and the argument that Neil was making, and McLuhan was making, and Innes was making, and in his own way, O'Loole was making, excuse me, was that if you think of them as culture, as an environment, the way culture is an environment, then you see that it's not one thing, and it's not an easy thing, and it's not the technology. Neil used to say that a medium is to the technology what the mind is to the brain.
Right.
We can know what the brain is, but we don't know what the hell the mind is. That's what's doing it. It's a thing. It's not a thing. It's a. If Neil was also in a semantics sense with the problem that Korzybski used, the noun problem in English and other European languages, turning every damn thing into a noun, like explosion. The hell kind of a noun is that? What kind of thing is an explosion? You know, the idea it's a thing. And that is solid. Neil's older son, Mark, would tell him carefully, there's nothing solid there, right? He's an astrophysicist, right? Now, he used to say that his father really didn't understand astrophysics, but he knew enough of it. So there's no, Neil was very much into that whole process idea. And it's and that, I think, is what ties into education, to trying to get students to understand that, but you can't do it by telling them. When Neil was teaching semantics, and he was giving, every time he would give the students, I was one of them, a problem. And the old-time students were very upset. They didn't want to have to go through the process of learning how stupid they were. They wanted him to tell them. That is, tell me the results of this experiment. They didn't want to do the experiment, which is to be part of it. And to know that you don't know what the hell you're doing. So all of these language games that you had to play, that always told you, the fact inference tests, we all were failing. The F test, have you ever take the F test, the semantic F test? You read a paragraph, it's got a bunch of F's in it, you have to count them. That's all, it's a simple damn thing. You never get it right. It's hard, it's really hard to get it right. And to the point it doesn't matter. But what it does is tell you how little you're aware of what you're doing. It's just to turn you into looking at yourself. And it's a hard thing to do. And over again, especially the teachers in the classroom, used to be demanding the answers, which is why when Neil wrote his books, he didn't give teacher editions. He never did a teacher edition, but both Reinhardt and Winston insisted there be a teacher edition, which other people did. That is, the answers. I mean, you ever thought about, Neil used to go crazy on that subject. I remember, all of us who were secondary school teachers, we all know we got the teacher's edition, which had all the answers in it. What the hell? How about if they gave the student's edition with the answers? What crazy stuff was that? I mean, it's that's what I thought the essence of it was. That is, just as you can't know what a poem means, you can only know what you mean by that encounter with that poem at that time. You can't know what it means. And that's pretty much true of the world. You cannot know what it means.
Beautifully put.
I want to just add a footnote to this, because you mentioned I.A. Richards. Mike noticed that I actually wrote this down during your initial talk. Because when you mentioned poetry, I thought immediately of him, and I remember Postman saying in seminar that there are people that, wherever you go, you find they've been there before you, and that for him it was I.A. Richards, and whose idea of the semantic triangle was very much parallel to what Korzybski was doing, as well as others. And we read Ogden and Richards, The Meaning of Meaning, in our doctoral seminar. But I.A. Richards was also a professor that McLuhan studied with. So there's a very strong connection there, and in a sort of secondary way influenced Walter Ong. And I do want to mention Ong's newest book, published posthumously, Language as Hermeneutic, which is a kind of introductory work. And part of this argument, I mean, hermeneutics is about the fact that we have to interpret texts, because you can't ask somebody, there's no dialogue with the text, but Ong argues that hermeneutics applies to oral communication as well, because we always have to interpret language. It's always about that. Now, Mike has something that he wants to add to this, and then, well, I'm just trying to get an order. I know the fellow in the back had a hand up before. You're fine with it? Okay, so Mike, and then I know you have a comment. You want to say something. Let's let Mike, and then we'll go to you.
I was really interested in the exercise, like what do you do walking into a 10th grade classroom, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you know, I can only answer that in terms of some of the things that I've done in a college classroom over the last couple of years, and I mentioned that I'd be semi-autobiographical without being self-indulgent, but I'm going to do it again. So I came up in Quaker education environments, which he likes to tease me about all the time. This Quaker guy, and I'm not Quaker, but I grew up in some Quaker school environments.
So does Wild Oats.
I sowed my wild oats, right? We were forced to attend silent meetings every week, where you sit co-present in silence with the community for periods of 45 minutes and beyond. And for a really young person, that was quite difficult. As a teenager, it was somewhat less difficult, but also a bit strenuous. And I use this to my advantage when I teach orality and literacy with students, to say, what's the ground of all this important business that we're busy doing, talking out loud to each other, sitting up here in front of you and your wonderful questions coming back at me. You know, we're really fixated on this, the figure above the ground, all the important business that we're talking about, and what is really the nature of this environment. And if you'll indulge me, I do this with students for 5, 10, and sometimes 15 minutes, and I won't obviously do that here, but if you'll indulge me for 10 or 15 seconds to just be silent, that something interesting happens, and it gets quite uncomfortable, where we realize how infrequently we're silent, and what it's like to be co-present with others, simply being, and it's a very unusual experience. So do it with me for 10 or 15 seconds. Were you counting in your head?
No,
I wasn't sure if you were testing me.
I was just thinking
Yeah.
this is just much like the class when I asked them a question.
Right. but the interesting thing,
I was just about to say that.
and the interesting thing about it is it works better when you do it for 5, 10, and 15 minutes, because it becomes excruciating. It really does. I mean, it's a thing to build up to. If you're able to do that for more than sort of 5, 10, or 15 minutes, you've already achieved some next level adulthood or consciousness of some sort. But it's really important, I think, to recognize that the ground for orality is the being co-present. And
What's the ecology part?
so the ecology, I mean, what does speech do to this environment?
Isn't that also the fact that you could speak your mind at meetings for worship,
Yes.
and nobody can comment on what you say?
Well, and that is the rules of that environment.
Exactly right,
yes.
and I think that is an incredibly
Yeah.
valuable experience.
Yes. And how to understand the respect for someone else's breaking of the silence without interrupting them, to be attentive to them, to recognize, I mean, now this is the spiritual aspect of it, is to recognize that something inside of you called the light has moved you to speech.
Very Jamesian.
It's yes, it's a very profound sort of experience for people who are Quaker, who are seriously spiritually and religiously Quaker. It's kind of remarkable to watch. Now, of course, they're called Quakers because they used to, quake when they had these experiences. But in more sort of contemporary and secular environments that still practice this, it's a way to call attention to the fact that you're in association with others, that speech is a sacred act, that the breaking of the silence is something to be taken seriously, and that for students in a classroom to then translate that new understanding of the act of speech and the ground that is co-presence in an environment is a way to then understand what the nature of the lecture might be, and since students don't ever talk to one another, it's very rare that students talk to one another, to build on that experience to say, now if you have things that are on your mind, that you feel moved to say, that we all take them sacredly and seriously and entertain them as a way to explore together, right? And I think that's a very difficult thing for students to do because nothing in their experience up to that point, either in their personal lives or in their educational lives, has led them to this. Unless perhaps they have something in their religious experience, whatever it may be, that sort of respects this idea. But I always thought that that was a useful way, while reading Walter Ong's Orality and Literacy, to give people in the classroom an experience with the very sacred nature of speech by understanding what the ground is, what the nature of the environment from which speech emerges and transforms.
It's
Can I
interesting
just
that,
add
I just want to say just that, I once gave a talk at Naropa University in Boulder, Colorado, which is a Buddhist school, and they explained that they started every class and this was like a different kind of session, but everything they did, they would start with a moment of silent meditation, which of course to me seemed really strange and weird being from New York, but it just made me think of that. I'm sorry, Maddie.
No, just really quick, I was, just the other day, for one period, I was with a student, he's a 7th grader, and unfortunately he's under a superintendent suspension. Anyway, I'm sitting with him, and like you said, with the silent, I walked in, I was told what he was suspended for, and the dean of the school said, look, just sit down with him, and just don't say anything, just give him his work, and let him do his work. And I came in, I introduced myself, my name is Patrick, I said, here's your work, I showed him a page to do, and like you, I remained silent, and I didn't speak. It was uncomfortable for me and uncomfortable for him. And then I thought, let me give him the opportunity, because the dean said, if he needs help, you can maybe just point to where he needs the help. So it was maybe like 13 or 14 seconds till he finally, I could say a word, because they said, be stone-faced, this kid is in major serious trouble. Finally, he was the one who started. He said, can you please help me? And I did. I said, okay, I'm a teacher, I didn't, it was, I think an English assignment. But I just felt the need, and here we are talking about, my dad's work and everything. I said, English language, And if I just can add just one thing, so even though it might be off topic, over the summer I just reread some of my dad's books, and it was very cathartic. It was very cathartic reading his words, and it just everything that he said, all the things that you said tonight, you guys said tonight, it was like an aha moment for me to read it. Anyway, just wanted to share.
Do you have others? Which is maybe.
I just want to say that I can't quote any of these people because it's not my background, and I can understand you wanting to questions from people who are in this field, but I'm going to speak up because I'm a product of what you're saying doesn't exist and what Jim is alluding to. Because I'm very grateful to my parents. I did go to a school that required napping.
Oh, good.
So there you go. But in my school, the very first thing you did, and we were 5 years old, is they read to you. And then they told you, they asked you questions about what's read, because we had to learn to listen.
Right.
Listening
That's
is an
right.
important component of communication, and it's a dying thing. No one's listening. And I go to dinner and I see people with their iPhones, and what appealed to me most, I met these people when they were at a conference in Maine, was them talking to each other. And I thought, wow, those are people talking to each other. Who are those people? I want to be part of that. Whatever that is, I want to be part of it. And I did. And the truth of the matter is, it was like we had to learn to debate because it was an exchange of ideas. It wasn't about you're a terrible person, you don't know what you're talking about, as some of the politicians seem to think a debate is, but it's an exchange of ideas. And a good debater has to be able to take either side. You can be assigned either side of that question. And by the time we were in 7th grade, we were required to read minimum 3 books a week. Granted, they were children's kind of books, but they weren't Ulysses. But it was ordered a process. First you have to hear, and then you have to see, and then you have to process. So I don't see how it has to be taught only by the time a person's in school, graduate school. It has to be taught in your life as a child. And I don't know why parents don't talk to their children anymore, but I see most of the parents in this neighborhood where I live have nannies, and nannies aren't talking to the children. They're on cell phone, and the kids are just doing nothing.
No, they're talking to them, but they're speaking Spanish.
Well, that's not bad if the kid learns that.
Parents don't understand them.
I kind of wanted to respond to Jim. It's a piece of what Jim was asking. A couple of years back, Stanley Fish, the professor of English literature and law, was at a conference out on the West Coast, and in the face of, in public higher education, taxpayers, footing the bill, and in private higher education, as expensive as it is, he said, people have a hard time understanding that sitting around, standing around, and talking is actually doing something. And, so before we're asked by the woman in front of you, what's our definition of media ecology? And Terry has a definition, and Lance has a definition, and I offer a definition, and it's 3 different definitions. And I don't know if any of them worked for you, or if all 3 of them worked for you, but everyone else is sitting in this audience. Okay, good, great, there you go. Everyone else is sitting in the audience. Well, they probably have a similar question, or some of them have already a definition that they think works for them. So, we're all coming from different places about all of this. When you ask about the ecology of this, right, it's really the environment of sitting around and via language trying to share ideas and experience. And the fact is that if we're up here sort of as the panelists talking more than the audience does, what we're going to offer is not to try to be understood necessarily so much as to try to not be misunderstood, and to offer up something that is worthy of this event, this context. And I don't know if I really still answered the question. And again, there was a lot packed into it. But I also want to just offer this, go back to something Terry said earlier, and say that with respect to those English literature professors, I want to tell them that I'm trying to help them as a media ecologist. That I'm trying to, help people understand that they should still be reading literature and loving literature and caring about it to the extent that these people who are fearful that we're, usurping their territory and their dominion. No, we're here to help.
Okay. All right, a fellow in the back.
Thank you. Yes, I'm an English professor. I live in Europa, actually. I went to Teachers College, where the president of Teachers College was simultaneously on the board of Pearson.
Oh, wow.
Which was strange. When we asked her, we did some sitting. When we asked her about it, she said, "My lawyers don't think it's a problem."
Wow.
So,
Good answer.
So I'm certainly more on the English writing end than the media ecology, but I appreciate all your talks. I think were great. You have I think you have a difficult path ahead of you because the gentleman who just spoke, there is a lot of this. Yes. There is a lot of this coming in with computers, which is certainly not media ecology at all. But there's a lot of this. What you mentioned, Apple comes into the room and offers, a laptop and things like that, and that is seen as kind of a systematizing education, and I fear that is being confused with any kind of talk of media ecology. So, not by you all, of course, but there's some kind of blurring of methods, I think.
I mean,
Yeah.
the way we think of ecology is to think of the classroom itself as an environment, right? And so the idea is, thinking about adding any technology into that environment, you don't get the environment plus the technology, you get an entirely new environment. Which is why I think that exercise I described about orality and about silence and the sacred nature of speech and of discourse is to preserve the environment as it was intended.
Absolutely.
Whatever we decide we want to do with it later is a matter of great discussion, right? Do we want the smart boards in the classrooms? Well, we changed the environment when we put in a blackboard, right? That changed the nature of the environment in some way. But whatever way we want to change the environment, we ought to at least know that we are changing the environment. We ought to at least know why we created the environment the way we created it in the first place. We ought to know how to do that very well before we then proceed to do different things to it and create new environments out of it. And I think that's really where we are completely lost,
Yeah.
is that people think, they talk about educational technology, and I always say, what about chalk? Right, every single time, and of course I feel, every time I say that, I feel like a fuddy-duddy. I mean, like, what about the chalk? I love writing on a blackboard, right? I feel like somebody's old uncle or something, but, what about the chalk? I mean, do you understand what you're doing when you spontaneously create on a board in front of others and have them follow along with you in the process of creation? That does something to them, versus a PowerPoint that you put up without them engaging with you in the spontaneous creation of writing and drawing and so forth. But that fascinates me, that people just go along with whatever new pedagogical strategies and technologies are thrown into the classroom without ever considering what the classroom is in the first place. That drives me absolutely nuts.
What about talking?
And talking.
There's actually a wonderful documentary, a PBS documentary, and it's got like a few different names, but I mean the one I remember is From Socrates to Cyberspace, and it includes interviews with Neil Postman that are interspersed. And there's one point, where he says, what can be more lovely than a student-teacher, the relationship. I mean, he doesn't quite put it that way, but that's the medium itself, is the relationship, the face-to-face relationship between a student and a teacher. And he explains that, well, and you may say that it's not convenient and you need to use technology, to use computers to connect them. And he uses the analogy, it's like a kid doesn't have a father, so you work out some arrangements where somebody else can substitute for a few hours every week. But it's not the same thing. It's still sad that we should weep and not celebrate because this kid still doesn't have a father. In the same way, teachers tend to celebrate these things, and he's saying we should be sad that we have to use, say if we have to do distance education or online education because there's not an alternative. That's something to be sad about, not to embrace openly and be happy about. I think since we have a hard stop at 9, and Cynthia, you had
very briefly
on that.
about your Quaker experience. When I was teaching in Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania, one of my colleagues was a very amusing person, and she used to go with her family to the Quaker meetings, and they would all sit around, and she had an aunt, she said, who would practice at home in front of the mirror for long periods of time what she was going to spontaneously say at the meeting. And she laughed and laughed.
And they do, when I entered into that system of education, they do warn you, that's not what you're supposed to do. And yet everyone feels nervous to stand up and actually, but that's part of overcoming the, being moved to speak is to, have something worthy of breaking the silence for.
You had a quick one?
Yeah, just your comment on blackboards. I think that's really valuable. Actually, I go to NYU. I'm in the Gallatin School, and my favorite experience with a professor has been George Schulman. I don't know if you're aware, but he does political theory, and he starts every class with the whiteboard, right? And he goes up and he'll ask a question. He goes, all right, give me a question. And anyone who decides to raise their hand will have to raise a question from the reading for that week. And he'll start with this one idea on the left side of the board. And then he'll just keep taking questions, and he'll literally create this web of ideas, filling up the entirety of the whiteboard. And then they'll spend the class basically just going through each of these ideas, and then complementing that with just like really close textual analysis. So that's brilliant. I think that's one of the most useful ways that I've engaged with reading and learning. But so also I wanted to say, I think to one of your questions, because it reminded me of something that Postman said, was trying to figure out how to make learning enjoyable to students, right? So I think that, Terry, something that you said was really interesting, because you mentioned that, like Ulysses, right? Why do we keep reading Ulysses, and what makes it like useful in like the modern day, and why do people still like enjoy reading books like Anna Karenina, for example, which is something that I keep coming back to, even though it still doesn't really make sense to me all the time. But I feel like I find new meaning in it every single time I read it. I think that's what makes it beautiful too, is that you really approach like the same book at different points in your life, and it really means something completely different according to that point and according to whatever context you find yourself in.
Do you know Vasu
She retired. She retired, Terry.
No, she's retired. She's still doing some work over there.
Oh, okay.
She was one of ours. That's my fault. You might want to read Neil's essay, Social Sciences, Moral Theology.
Okay.
You would find that it's a short essay. It's in a book called Conscientious Objections. It's a wonderful comparison between science and social science, and in that he talks about novelists knowing as much about psychology as Freud, as much about sociology as Max Weber or whatever. You'll like that a lot.
Yeah.
That might help.
And I think since our time is up, I mean, that's,
Doris?
well, we have actually a few people that we really have to, I mean, Sal, you want to, it's up to Sal. All right, go ahead.
You have to face the camera,
Oh, she's on camera.
It's okay, go ahead.
Oh, okay. I was going to say there's a difference between doing something by yourself and doing it with a group. The silence business, there are lots of times people sit in silence by themselves, but when you do it with a big group, it's a completely different feeling and purpose. So that's just, like when you're reading a book about Francisco or whoever, when you're reading it by yourself, it's different than when you discuss it with other people. You know, that's where the thing comes to meaning.
Okay, thank you. And I think we can end with Neil's quote, "Children are the living messages we send to a time we will not see."
Oh, that's beautiful.
It is, and it's one that we need to repeat often. So before we close, I want to note that our next session will be Wednesday, December 19th, and we'll have a panel consider the question of what is sanity, and have we lost it?
Who's qualified to talk about that?
Nobody.
Anybody you know?
Nobody.
Okay.
That's just an
On the
opinion.
panel, may I suggest someone? Madeline's 6-year-old son, Matt. He's a genius.
Okay. Well, that's one.
Someday.
That's one.
So I want to thank our panelists. This has been wonderful. Thank you.